Welcome back, KeyForgers. Today I have Falanest, the Judge, Spirit, Untamed, Logos and Shadows. This was an Archon deck that I took to an event at D20 in Watford. We'll go through the deck, we'll do a quick breakdown, and then I'll let you know how I got on. Bottom card coming out, turning over. We're starting out with Untamed. It is an AOA deck, Age of Ascension, and here we have a Dusk Witch. 1 power, Omega and Elusive, your creatures enter play ready. A second Dusk Witch. Glimmer, 1 power with Alpha, play, return a card from your discard pile to your hand. Grove Keeper, 3 power, at the end of your turn give each neighbouring creature a +1 power counter. Key Charge is an action, play, lose 1 amber, if you do, you may forge a key at current cost. Regrowth is an action, you get an amber when you play it, play, return a creature from your discard pile to your hand. A second Regrowth. Rust Nora, 4 power. Fight, destroy an artifact. If that artifact had an amber bonus, you gain that much amber. Nepenthe Seed is an artifact. Omni ability, sacrifice Nepenthe Seed. Return a card from your discard pile to your hand. Panpacker Anger, 5 power. Creatures to the right of Panpacker Anger in the battle line get +2 power. Panpacker Jagger, 3 power with Skirmish. Creatures to the left of Panpacker Jagger in the battle line gain Skirmish. Fuzzy Gruan, 5 power. You get 2 amber when you play it. Play, your opponent gains 1 amber. On to Shadows now. Bad Penny, 1 power. Destroyed. Return Bad Penny to your hand. Dust Chronicles is an action. You get an amber when you play it. Play. If your opponent has more amber than you, draw a card. If you have more amber than your opponent, archive a card. Life for a Life is an action. You get an amber when you play it. Play, sacrifice a creature to deal 6 damage to a creature. Nerve Blast is an action. Play, steal 1 amber. If you do, deal 2 damage to a creature. Ronnie Risk Locks, 2 power. Play, steal 1. If your opponent has 7 amber or more, steal 2 amber instead. A second Ronnie. Swindle is an action. Alpha and Omega, play, steal 3 amber. Whistling Darts is an action. You get an amber when you play it. Play, deal 1 damage to each enemy creature. A second Whistling Darts. Yancey Gang, 5 power. Action, steal 1 amber. A second Yancey Gang. Key of Darkness is an action. Play, forge a key at +6 current cost. If your opponent has no amber, forge a key at +2 current cost instead. And finally on to Logos. Archimedes, 2 power with Elusive. Each of Archimedes' neighbours gains destroyed. Archive this creature. Cutthroat Research is an action. You get an amber when you play it. Play, steal 2 amber if your opponent has 8 amber or more. Library of Babel is an artifact. Action, draw a card. A second Library of Babel. Poke is an action. You get an amber when you play it. Play, deal 1 damage to an enemy creature. If this damage destroys that creature, draw a card. Professor Statikin, 2 power. Reap, draw a card for each friendly Logos creature. A second Professor Statikin. Titan Librarian, 4 power. At the end of your turn, if Titan Librarian is not on a flank, archive a card. Quantum Finger Trap is an artifact. You get an amber when you play it. Action, swap the position of 2 creatures in a battle line. Sloppy Lab Work is an action. You get an amber when you play it. Play, archive a card, discard a card. Dizania, 4 power. Play, your opponent discards each of their archived cards. You gain 1 amber for each card discarded this way. Harland Mindlock, 1 power. Play, take control of an enemy flank creature until Harland Mindlock leaves play. There we have it. Let's take a closer look. The deck breakdown was 19 creatures, 13 actions, 4 artifacts and 0 upgrades. We had 12 printed amber, which isn't bad. If we start with amber control, it was all in shadows apart from 1 card, which was the Cutthroat Research. The card that never really works, but when it does, it's epic. It didn't work for me on the night, I can tell you that now. But it does give you an amber pip. And then we come to shadows. We had the Swindle. Alpha and Omega, it's a straight steal 3. Very good if it's going to put you off check and take your opponent off check. But that is the only thing you will do that turn. We had the Nerve Blast to steal 1, and then if we do steal 1, deal 2 damage to a creature. Just bear in mind, if you're the only player with creatures on the board, you will have to deal 2 damage to one of your own creatures if you do steal. The 2 Ronnies, straight steal 1, and if our opponent has 7 or more, we steal 2 instead. And then we have the Yancey gang. We had 2 of them, 5 power, quite a big hefty creature for shadows. Action, steal 1 amber. We had no scaling amber control, and with the majority of it being in shadows, if our opponent was on check or we did have to stop them ramping, we would have had shadows in hand and call shadows for that turn. So it can lock you into a house that maybe you don't want to go into, which I did find as I played. Anything that was steal can be considered expected amber, so your opponent must have amber for this deck to ramp even a little bit. Other expected amber pretty much came from our creatures. And one thing I did find, with 19 creatures in the deck, I really needed a Dusk Witch on the board for this deck to speed up to match a lot of the decks that I played that night. If my opponent had board advantage and I didn't have a Dusk Witch, it was extremely hard for me to get it back because of the lack of control, which we'll get to in a second. With that passive ability of our creatures enter play ready, it was a straight reap or fight or action, which worked very well with some of the Logos creatures that I'll talk about later. We had Dizania. 4 power with a play effect of your opponent discards each of their archived cards. If you're up against a heavy archive deck, this is absolute gold. I did manage to get 6 amber at one point with Dizania because my opponent forgot that it was in my deck, or they just didn't look at my deck list properly. And then finally, one of the main reasons why I chose this deck was because of the 2 key cheats. We had the key charge, lose 1 amber. If you do, you may forge a key at current cost. And then we had Key of Darkness. Forge a key at +6 current cost, so usually double, but it's only +2 if our opponent has no amber. So if on those shadows turns we're able to steal all of our opponent's amber and get it down to 0, hopefully we could forge a key. I can tell you now, I didn't manage to pull Key of Darkness off, but I did manage to get a key charge off in 2 of the games. Expected amber could also come from our artifact control card, which was our Rust Nora, the creature with the fight ability of destroy an artifact. If that artifact had an amber bonus, we gain that much amber. It's a fight ability, so Rust Nora must survive, and at one point I didn't want to fight with Rust Nora because I would have destroyed my own artifacts for no particular reason. Which brings us to creature control. Now I put the Jagger and the Anger both under creature control, because if Jagger is on the right, which would be over here, all creatures to the left would get Skirmish, and if Anger is on the left, all creatures to the right get +2 power. So they were very nice to have in play, and if I did have a battle line, that was a huge advantage for me. In Logos we had Poke. Action card, deal 1 damage to an enemy creature. If it destroys that creature, draw a card. It didn't work very well. Once I hit a Rad Penny, that was about it. We had Harland Mindlock. Very nice, a 1-powered creature. When you play it, you take control of an enemy flank creature until Harland Mindlock leaves play. Putting this next to my Archimedes, which we'll come to in a second, was quite a nice hit, because that meant they had to take out the Archimedes before they hit my Mindlock. And in Shadows we had 2 Whistling Darts, deal 1 damage to each enemy creature, and we had Life for a Life, which was one of our biggest hitters when it came to creature control. We sacrifice a creature to deal 6 damage to another creature. Yes, the prime target was that bad penny because it would pop back into my hand. There was no board wipes, and I did find myself struggling to maintain board control because we didn't have that many beefy creatures. I was up against a Sanctum once and it was just too much armour to get through. There was quite a bit of efficiency, which was another reason it led me to pick this deck. The Dusk Chronicles in Shadows. Nice action because if your opponent has more amber than you, draw a card. If we have more amber than our opponent, we archive a card, so it's always going to trigger. Unless you have the same amount of amber as your opponent. We had 2 Library of Babel. Action, draw a card in Logos. We had the Titan Librarian. 4 power. A very nice passive effect here, and you know how much I love a passive effect. At the end of your turn, if Titan Librarian is not on a flank, archive a card. Now this happens after your draw step, so you will have a full hand. then you'll archive a card. So you are starting your next turn with 5 cards, usually if you don't have an increase or a decrease. We had the sloppy lab work, archive a card, discard a card, and then we had the 2 Professor Stutterkin, which, when they're both on the board, is a hell of a lot of cards to draw if you have a couple of other Logos creatures out, which in one game I did. I drew about, I think it was 4 cards twice, which is quite nice. So I drew an additional 8 cards during that turn. Your opponent then takes them out pretty quickly if they hadn't realised how powerful they could be before. So actually speeding through our deck, we was able to do that quite well. When it comes to recursion, we had that Archimedes. Like I mentioned, putting that Haaland Mindlock on one side and actually the Dizania on the other is pretty good because they have to take out that Archimedes before they take either of those others out. The rest was in Untamed. We had the Glimmer. 1 power, it's an alpha, so it must be the first card you play. And you return a card from your discard pile to your hand, which is very nice to get that key charge back into hand. We had 2 Regrowth. Return a creature from your discard pile to your hand. That was quite nice because I used to use it with my Fuzzy Gruen. Nice little ramp there, especially if you had the key charge in hand. And if you didn't have the Glimmer, you could use the Nepenthe Seed to get any card from your discard pile and put it back into your hand. And that's a nice Omni ability there on an artifact, which was a reason why I didn't want to fight with my Rust Nora at some points. The only other 2 cards that were in the deck that we haven't looked at yet were the Quantum Finger Trap to swap the position of 2 creatures in the battle line. Very good for either protecting some of our creatures if we had a taunt, or moving some of your opponent's creatures away from taunts, or putting them on the flank if you had something like a Spike Trap. It's quite a nice manipulation, but it's only good in specific circumstances. And then the final card was the Grovekeeper. 3 power, again, a nice passive effect. At the end of your turn, give each neighbouring creature a +1 power counter. I played 3 games that night. I lost the first one absolutely miserably to a Worlds Collide deck that just flooded the board and I couldn't keep up. Second game was a Mass Mutation deck, and I was able to get an established battle line with the 2 Professor Stutterkins, a Dusk Witch, and I just swarmed my opponent and generated so much amber, and I won by key cheating in the end. The last game was against another Mass Mutation deck where they had huge Story on board along with huge Sanctum board. I couldn't touch it. Every time I put something down, they made sure they took it out on their turn. I couldn't establish. I was just playing cards for the amber to try and race to a key cheat, but they outpaced me, so I lost. So I went 1-2. I did take it on TCO the night before and I played 2 Winds of Exchange decks. Same deck, 2 games, and I won both. It does okay if the opponent does not establish a huge board with beefy creatures that have a lot of armor. And I think you need at least 1 Dusk Witch on board for this deck really to do what it's meant to, which is win by key cheating. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to take it for a run on the Crucible. Apart from that, all that remains for me to say is good luck, have fun, keep forging.